to UNHCR to manage the refugee flows, or there are good ways to support independent journalism still in Ukraine, so we do get an accurate sense of what's going on the ground, supporting papers like the Kyiv Independent. There's ways to directly give money to the National Bank of Ukraine in order to support the armed forces of Ukraine through the National Bank of Ukraine website. I mean, there are various, depending on what anyone's focus is, there is a way to financially support that. But there's also a question about our own societies. The kind of disorder and division that President Putin is seeking to sow in Ukraine and across the West has in many ways taken hold in our societies. We have had oligarchs spending their money and getting political outcomes that are not really in the West's interests, but are in the interests of Russia and other autocrats. We have provided an opportunity for Russian state-funded media outlets to tell their distorted version of reality to our societies. And we have had politicians across our societies echo the talking points of Russia, denounce core principles of democracy, and question the reality of truth, which is something profoundly Putin-esque. Us opening our eyes to the fact that these toxic behaviors exist in our societies and cracking down on that, or just turning a new leaf and saying we will no longer flirt with autocracy because it leads to the kind of suffering and the kind of behavior we're seeing from Russia and Ukraine. We will learn to live without these ill-gotten gains, as President Biden said in the State of the Union this week. We will reinvigorate our societies in a more democratic and in a more cohesive and healthy manner. That is incredibly important, because when you look at President Putin's aims, not just in Ukraine, but across the world, is for disorder and autocracy and the strongman approach to survive, for there not to be opposition, for people's voices not to matter. And if we start recognizing those same trends at home, we'll be much more resilient against his influence for the rest of the century.
We will no longer flirt with autocracy. Christine Brzezinnya is head of the geopolitics team for the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
University and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He served as the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine from 1998 to 2000. Ambassador Pfeiffer, thank you so much for being here. So Vladimir Putin was serving as prime minister and then president of Russia while you were ambassador. Was the Clinton administration concerned about Putin and his leadership at that time?
You know, back in when I was in Ukraine in 2000, after Mr. Putin had become president, the Ukrainians were a little bit nervous, but this is a different Vladimir Putin than we're seeing today, I think.
Different in what sense?
Early on, I mean, Mr. Putin was fairly calculated. He did the balancing of costs and benefits. He took risks, but they were manageable risks. I think what you're seeing today, particularly with regards to Ukraine, is a much more emotional, even angry Putin. And we saw it in this distorted history that he presented about Ukraine, this long essay he wrote last summer, and then in the speech he gave on February 21, which is really his declaration of war against Ukraine.
Now, I am presuming, but help me to understand, in a diplomatic role, what happens when you shift from dealing with a leadership that is taking risks, but where you can understand the calculations, to one that does seem to be more emotive in its cause?
Yeah, it becomes a little bit more difficult. I mean, I look at the risks and the costs that Russia's undertaken by this invasion. First and foremost, the risks and costs that the Russian military is now encountering. By admission of the Russian Ministry of Defense, Russia's lost 500 soldiers killed in action. My guess is that the number is substantially higher. And those numbers are going to continue to grow. And even if Russia wins, even if Russia defeats the Ukrainian military, they're going to find themselves occupying a country the size of Texas, or at least part of that country, with an angry, hostile population. And on top of that, now you have the economic sanctions, which are having a huge impact on Russia. And you have things like he's galvanized NATO. In 1 week, you saw Germany basically change an approach of 5 decades towards Russia. So I look at those costs and say, those are huge costs. They may overwhelm the sort of gain he hopes to achieve, but Mr. Putin seems to be operating on a different logic, and I think that is in part due to the emotion he attaches to the Ukraine issue.
Given this shift, this sort of new Putin, as you're describing, and this willingness to take risks that seem far less calculated, easy to at least determine what they are, do you think that there's anything the West might have done to de-escalate by not expanding NATO in the 90s and 2000s, or was that expansion the right move? I guess I'm wondering, to the extent to which that expansion initiated some of this emotive response from Putin.
Well, the Russians have tried to frame this crisis as a crisis first and foremost between NATO and Russia. And the Russians talk about how NATO aggressively expanded to Russia's borders. Now, NATO took a lot of steps, for example, saying we are not going to put combat troops on the territory of new members to make enlargement non-threatening to Russia. But the last NATO member to border Russia joined the alliance in 2004. So why are we having this crisis now? This crisis is much more about the concern in the Kremlin that Ukraine is slipping irretrievably out of Moscow's orbit towards the west. But quite frankly, nothing has done more than Russian policy the last 8 years to drive Ukraine away. The seizure of Crimea, the conflict in Donbass, which killed 14,000 people, and now this 8-day-old invasion of Ukraine.
When you think about U.S. presidential administrations, the last two, do you have a sense of, again, how those administrations' policies towards Russia may also be part of what is happening in this moment?
Well, I look at the Trump administration policy, and my guess is it confused the Russians. I often joke that there was probably no harder job in the Kremlin than being the American watcher and trying to explain the difference between President Trump, who basically never criticized President Putin, talked about wanting to have a great relationship with Russia, and an administration which actually pursued some fairly tough steps. I think the advantage of the Biden administration was there was clarity. You actually had a president who was in sync with this policy, and the Russians don't like the policy, but there was clarity. And between Washington and Moscow, I think if predictability and clarity is always important. I don't want the Russians miscalculating the American reaction. The ironic thing is, last summer, Presidents Biden and Putin seemed to set an agenda, and in the first 3 or 4 months after their meeting in Geneva, you saw some small positive steps in U.S.-Russia relations. Of course, that's all been swept away now by the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Is President Biden's commitment not to send U.S. troops into Ukraine the right decision?